He's a type of player you'd never find in America. Buck Showalter said this not during a post-game press conference, not in a prepared speech, not in a moment designed for public consumption. He said it quietly, almost to himself, standing in a dugout tunnel after watching Ohtani throw 97 miles per hour and then walk to the plate 30 minutes later, like the two things were completely unrelated. Like doing both wasn't the baseball equivalent of climbing Everest barefoot. Like the rest of the sport hadn't spent a century proving it was impossible. Showalter had managed in this league for decades. He had seen Ken Griffey Jr., he had seen Derek Jeter. He had seen players who redefined what the word exceptional meant. And still, standing in that tunnel, watching Shohei Ohtani exist in a category that had no name yet, the only thing he could find to say was that this was something America had never produced and might never produce again. When Shohei Ohtani arrived in Major League Baseball in 2018, the people who were paid to evaluate talent for a living did not know what to do with him. Not because he was unimpressive. Because he was too impressive in too many directions at once, and the tools that scouts had developed over generations were built to measure one thing at a time. You evaluated a pitcher by his fastball velocity, his secondary offerings, his command, his ability to miss bats at the highest level of competition. You evaluated a hitter by his exit velocity, his launch angle, his plate discipline, his capacity to handle elite pitching. Nobody had built a tool that measured both simultaneously because nobody had needed one. The assumption, baked into the sport for over 100 years, was that the two skills existed in opposition to each other. That pursuing both meant sacrificing the ceiling of each. That the human body, the human mind, the human development timeline simply could not sustain both at the same level. Former Angels general manager Billy Epler, who was the man who ultimately signed Ohtani in 2017, has spoken about what those early internal conversations looked like. He described a front office that was genuinely divided. Not about whether Ohtani was talented, because that was beyond dispute. But about whether what he was attempting was sustainable. Whether the workload would eventually force a choice. Whether the arm that generated those pitch velocities could coexist long-term with the swing that produced those exit velocities. Epler said the scouts who had watched him in Japan came back with reports that were unlike anything they had ever written. The numbers were extraordinary in both directions. The physical tools were legitimate in both directions. And the mental approach, the preparation, the competitive intelligence that Ohtani brought to both sides of his game, was something that the report struggled to quantify because there wasn't a box on the form designed to capture it. The managers who have faced Ohtani across a lineup card describe the experience with a consistency that is itself remarkable. The specific words change from person to person, but the feeling underneath them is always the same. It is the feeling of playing a game you thought you understood and discovering there is an entire dimension to it that you had never been required to account for before. Terry Francona, who managed against Ohtani during his time with the Cleveland Guardians, described the strategic problem Ohtani creates as something that doesn't have a clean solution. He said that when Ohtani is pitching, your entire focus as a manager is on getting to his pitch count, extending at-bats, forcing him to work, because the longer he throws the more vulnerable he becomes. And then the moment he steps out of the game, he's still in your lineup as a hitter, which means the threat doesn't leave with him. Francona said it felt like playing against a team that had figured out how to keep their best weapon in the game no matter what inning it was. Dusty Baker, who managed the Houston Astros against Ohtani in multiple high-stakes situations, talked about the psychological dimension of facing him in a way that went beyond pure strategy. He said there is something that happens to a dugout when Ohtani comes to the plate in the first inning of a game he is also starting as a pitcher. The energy changes. The focus sharpens in a way that Baker described as almost involuntary, like the body recognizing a threat before the mind has finished processing it. He said he had watched opposing hitters walk back to the dugout after striking out against Ohtani and sit down with an expression that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite admiration but was somewhere in the complicated territory between the two. The look of someone who had just experienced something they couldn't entirely explain. The players who have shared a clubhouse with Ohtani speak about him with a reverence that is unusual in a sport populated by elite athletes who are deeply accustomed to being the best person in every room they enter. Mike Trout, who spent years alongside Ohtani in Anaheim and whose own career represents one of the most sustained peaks of individual excellence the sport has ever seen, has described watching Ohtani prepare for games as a genuinely humbling experience. Trout said that Ohtani's preparation routine is unlike anything he has encountered in his career. The video study is relentless. The physical work is meticulous. The attention to detail in every aspect of both the pitching side and the hitting side is something Trout described as existing at a level that most players apply to only one thing. He said Ohtani applies that level to two things simultaneously and somehow loses nothing in the division. Freddie Freeman, who joined the Dodgers the same year Ohtani signed and has watched him operate up close through an entire season, talks about Ohtani with the specific wonder of someone who has had the unusual privilege of proximity to something historic. Freeman said that what strikes him most is not the raw talent, because talent at this level is expected. What strikes him is the consistency of Ohtani's emotional baseline. The way he carries the same demeanor into the clubhouse on the morning after a home run as he does on the morning after a bad outing. The absence of the peaks and valleys that characterize even the greatest players Freeman has known. He said Ohtani seems to have found a way to live inside a competitive environment at a temperature that most people would find impossible to maintain over the course of a 162-game season. The statistics that surround Shohei Ohtani's career are extraordinary in their own right. The ERA figures. The home run totals. The strikeout numbers. The slugging percentages. The WAR values that force analysts to build new frameworks just to contain them. But the people who have watched him closest are consistent in saying that the numbers, remarkable as they are, do not fully capture what makes him different. They capture the output. They do not capture the process. They do not capture what it looks like from the inside of a dugout when Ohtani is locked in on a Tuesday night in April against a lineup that has seen his pitches twice before and is beginning to make adjustments. They do not capture the competitive intelligence that shifts his approach mid-game in ways that opposing hitters describe as deeply disorienting. They do not capture what Mark Prior, his pitching coach with the Dodgers, described as an almost preternatural ability to feel the game in real time and respond to it rather than simply executing a predetermined plan. Prior spoke about Ohtani's in-game adaptability in terms that were more philosophical than analytical. He said that great pitchers generally fall into two categories. There are pitchers who execute, who have a plan and trust their stuff enough to impose it on hitters regardless of what the hitter is doing. And there are pitchers who read, who are constantly processing information and adjusting their approach based on what they see in real time. Prior said most pitchers live primarily in one category or the other. He said Ohtani does both simultaneously, reading the hitter while executing with the precision of someone operating entirely from a plan, and that the combination of those two things at his level of physical ability is what separates him from everyone who came before. What Shohei Ohtani has done to baseball is not simply athletic. It is philosophical. He has forced a sport that was deeply comfortable with its own assumptions to examine those assumptions and find that some of them were wrong. The belief that two-way players couldn't survive at the highest level wasn't based on evidence. It was based on the absence of someone willing and capable of proving otherwise. Ohtani provided the evidence. And now the sport sits with the uncomfortable and thrilling reality that everything it thought it knew about what one player could do was drawn from a sample size of people who were not Shohei Ohtani. Dave Roberts, who manages him now and watches him from closer than almost anyone, was asked recently what he thinks baseball will say about Ohtani 50 years from now. Roberts smiled in the way people smile when they are asked to summarize something they know is beyond summarizing. He said he thought baseball would say that Ohtani came along at a moment when the sport needed to be reminded of something. He said baseball would say that Ohtani reminded everyone that the limits people accept as permanent are very often just the limits of their imagination. And then Roberts paused for a moment before adding quietly that he thought Ohtani would probably still be redefining those limits long after the conversation about where they were supposed to be had been entirely forgotten.